Chapter 66 The Memory of Steel. The wind howling off the sunset sea carried the bitter chill of deep winter, but as the royal fleet vanished over the horizon, Eddard Stark felt only the warmth of a completed duty. King Robert Baratheon had sailed south, his thirst for battle slaked, his hold on the Iron Throne secured by the breaking of pike. Behind him, he left a pacified island chain and a warden of the north whose reputation had grown from a quiet shadow into an undeniable tempest. Ned turned his horse away from the docks of Sea Dragon Point. His brother Benjen would remain here, taking up his rightful seat as lord of the newly built fortress, with Dacy Mormont at his side. The western coast was secure. The Leviathans of the north patrolled the waters, and the Ironborn threat was relegated to the history books. As Ned's escort prepared to march back to Winterfell, his hand brushed against the heavy, leather-bound scabbard strapped securely to his saddle. Red Rain. When Benjen had returned from the bloody shores of Old Wyke, he had presented the legendary Valyrian steel sword to Ned, offering it to the head of House Stark. Ned had initially refused, insisting the one who won it should wield it. But Benjen, showing a wisdom beyond his years, had recognized the burden of the blade. It was a Ryaen's sword, stolen by the drum centuries ago. Its crimson ripples and lion-crested pommel were a constant, glaring reminder of its origins. It did not fit the Lord of Sea Dragon Point. It did not fit a wolf. Ned had accepted the sword, promising to keep it safe. But as they rode east, following the smooth, gray ribbon of the paved road through the Wolfswood, Ned's intentions for the blade had crystallized. He would not simply keep it in a vault, nor would he sell it to Tywin Lannister. He was going to break it, and from its pieces he would forge something entirely new. Trailing behind the heavily armed northern vanguard was a procession of a different sort. Hundreds of wagons and thousands of weary feet marched under the protection of the dire wolf banners. These were the thralls and salt wives liberated from Harlaw and Old Wyke. They were a broken, hollow-eyed people, stolen from their homes across the known world and forced into brutal servitude. They shivered in the northern cold, despite the heavy wool blankets Ned had ordered distributed among them, their eyes fearful and uncertain of what this new captivity would bring. Ned kept the pace steady but manageable, ensuring the supply carts were opened freely to feed the emancipated captives. They had seen enough cruelty. The North would show them something else entirely. The journey took little more than a week, a testament to the sheer speed allowed by the new roads. When the towering, ancient walls of Winterfell finally broke through the tree line, a deep, resonant horn blast welcomed the Lord home. The heavy iron portcullis of the Hunter's Gate was already raised. As Ned rode into the courtyard, he was met with a chaotic, joyous explosion of life. The entire household had gathered. The courtyard was a sea of gray and white, voices rising in a roar of cheers. But Ned's eyes bypassed the cheering guards and the bowing stewards. He looked only to the steps of the great keep. Ashera stood there, a vision of absolute radiance amidst the gray stone. She wore a gown of deep violet velvet lined with thick silver fox fur, her dark hair cascading over her shoulders. In her arms, wrapped in heavy swaddling clothes, rested their youngest son, little Ricard. Before Ned could even bring his destrier to a full halt, a small, dark-haired blur launched itself down the steps. Father! Cregan Stark, nearly 8 years old and moving with the boundless energy of a hunting hound, bounded across the courtyard. Ned swung down from the saddle, his armor clanking loudly, and caught the boy mid-air. He hoisted Cregan up, earning a squeal of pure delight. "You grew again, you little giant," Ned laughed, his chest aching with profound relief. "I practiced every day," Cregan declared proudly, gripping Ned's armored shoulders. "Uncle Arthur says my footwork is getting less terrible." "High praise indeed," Ned chuckled, setting the boy down and ruffling his dark curls. Next came Rhaenys, walking with a measured, regal grace that belied her youth, though her dark eyes shone with excitement. "Welcome home, Uncle Ned. Did you sink their ships?" "Every last one of them, little son," Ned promised, offering her a respectful, affectionate bow. Jon stood a pace behind her, quiet and observant as always. He did not rush forward, but his gray eyes were locked onto Ned with a deep, silent adoration. Ned stepped past Rhaenys and pulled the solemn boy into a firm embrace. "I missed you, Jon," Ned whispered into the boy's hair. "I kept watch, father," Jon replied softly, his small arms wrapping around Ned's waist. "Just as you asked. And a fine watch it was," Ned praised. He moved toward the steps, where a whirlwind of activity was barely being contained by the nursemaids. 3-year-old Sansa stood politely, offering a shy, beautiful smile, while little Arya, barely a year and a half old, was actively trying to escape her nurse's grip to run into the mud. Ned kissed Sansa's forehead and scooped up the squirming Arya, who immediately began pulling on his beard with surprising strength. He finally reached Ashera. She looked at him, her violet eyes swimming with unshed tears of relief. He smelled of horse, sweat, and cold iron, but she did not care. She stepped forward, balancing the sleeping baby Ricard on one arm, and wrapped her free arm around Ned's neck. Ned leaned in and captured her lips in a kiss that was deep, desperate, and completely unconcerned with the hundreds of eyes watching them in the courtyard. It was the kiss of a man who had returned from the edge of the world. "You kept your promise?" Ashera whispered against his lips when they finally parted. "I always do," Ned murmured, looking down at the sleeping face of his newest son. Little Ricard possessed a tuft of dark hair and the peaceful expression of a child who knew only warmth. "The pack is safe, my love. The West is quiet." For the next 3 days, Ned surrendered the mantle of the warlord and fully embraced the duties of the warden. His first priority was the thousands of emancipated thralls camped in the sprawling fields outside the winter town. Ned stood on a wooden platform hastily erected in the center of their massive encampment. The people gathered before him were a diverse, battered lot, some bearing the pale skin and light hair of the Iron Islands, others with the olive complexions of Essos or the fair features of the Reach. They looked up at him with apprehension, waiting to learn what kind of master this northern wolf would be. "You were stolen from your homes," Ned's voice boomed across the silent crowd, amplified by the hidden power he wielded to ensure every soul heard his decree. "You were stripped of your names, your labor, and your dignity. The Ironborn called you property." Ned paused, his gray eyes sweeping over the shivering masses. "In the north, we do not own men," Ned declared, his words ringing like struck iron. "The air you breathe here is free air. The sweat you bleed here belongs to you." A murmur of disbelief rippled through the crowd. "You are no longer thralls," Ned continued. "You are free men and women. But freedom does not fill an empty belly, and winter is coming. For those who wish to return to their original homes in the south or across the narrow sea, ships will be provided at White Harbor when the spring thaws the ice. You have my word." He stepped closer to the edge of the platform. "But for those who have no home left to return to, or those who wish to forge a new one, the north is vast. We have lands in the new gift that require tending. We have glassworks that require firemen. We have roads that require builders. If you choose to stay, you will be given tools, you will be given shelter, and you will be paid a fair, living wage for your labor. You will live under the protection of House Stark, and no man shall ever raise a whip against you again." The silence that followed was heavy, absolute. And then a single man near the front, an older captive missing half his teeth, dropped to his knees in the mud. He bowed his head, weeping silently. Slowly, the entire camp followed suit, a tidal wave of humanity dropping to the earth, not in subservience to a master, but in overwhelming gratitude to a savior. Over the next week, Ned worked tirelessly alongside Maester Luwin and the stewards to organize the heavy burden of settling the freedmen. Families were relocated to the fertile lands of the gift, swelling the populations of the mountain clan holdfasts. Skilled artisans were taken into the bustling workshops of the winter town. The women taken as salt wives were given sanctuary, protection, and positions within the extensive castle households of the northern lords. The north did not just take in the captives. It put them to work, feeding the growing prosperity Ned had meticulously cultivated. With the duties of the occupation finally managed, and his family settled back into their peaceful routines, Ned found himself with a rare commodity: free time. He retreated to his private solar deep within the great keep. The room was fiercely hot, the iron pipes drawing steam from the deep springs working to combat the deep winter chill setting in outside the thick stone windows. He barred the heavy oak door. He walked to his desk, where a long bundle wrapped in heavy, oil-treated leather rested. Ned unwrapped the bundle, revealing the dark, crimson-rippled blade of red rain. He sat down in his heavy chair, laying the Valyrian steel across his knees. He ran a callous thumb over the ruby set into the pommel. It was a beautiful weapon, forged with spells and fire, but it was tainted by its history. Ned closed his eyes. He centered his breathing, falling into the deep, rhythmic trance of his meditations. He was not seeking to lift a stone or enhance his muscles. He was reaching for a far more esoteric, dangerous application of his hidden gifts, the ability to read the history, the emotions, and the lingering life left behind in cold, unfeeling things. It was a skill rarely mastered, for it required opening one's mind to the chaotic, often violent memories trapped within the steel. Ned placed both of his bare hands flat against the cold, rippled steel of the blade. He pushed his awareness into the metal. At first, there was only resistance. Valyrian steel was not normal iron. It was folded with magic, dense and unyielding. But Ned persisted, feeding his connection to the earth into the blade, searching for the resonance of the men who had forged it. The vision hit him with brutal force, snapping his head back. He tasted salt and blood. He heard the screaming of men and the splintering of wood. He felt the exultation of Dunstan drum, the dark, bloody joy of cleaving a man's skull. He pushed deeper, past the centuries of iron-born reaving, peeling back the layers of salt and slaughter. He saw the red lion banners. He felt the arrogant pride of the reigns of Castamere. Deeper, Ned gritted his teeth, sweat beading on his forehead despite the heat of the room. He was swimming upstream against a river of time, searching for the source. The visions grew chaotic, fragmented. Fire, screams, the clash of empires. And then, the world dissolved into a blinding, white-hot inferno. Ned gasped, his mind transported across millennia and oceans. He was no longer in Winterfell. He stood in the heart of a mountain that bled liquid fire. The heat was apocalyptic, turning the very air to shimmering distortion. He saw the ancient smiths of Valyria. They were stripped to the waist, their skin gleaming with sweat and soot. Ned watched, entranced, as the true nature of the metal unfolded before his mind's eye. He realized the truth of the spell-forged steel. The blood magic, the dragon glass, the dragon fire, those were the ingredients required to create the alloy from scratch. But Red Rain was already Valyrian steel. The magic was permanently locked within its dark ripples, baked into its very core. It did not need to be recreated. It only needed to be freed. To reshape the blade, the ancient smiths did not rely on sorcery. They relied on overwhelming, unimaginable heat. Heat profound enough to melt the indestructible metal back into a liquid state, allowing it to be poured and recast without losing its enchanted nature. Ned broke the connection, gasping for air, his eyes flying open. He collapsed back into his chair, his chest heaving, his hands trembling violently. He stared at Red Rain. The secret was not a spell. It was the forge. He did not have a dragon to provide the heat, but he had the deep earth, he had pure coal, and he had a mind that understood the mechanics of a forced air furnace. For the next 3 days, Ned did not leave the depths of Winterfell. He enlisted the aid of Mikken. Together, they descended into the deepest sublevel of the Great Keep, near the very source of the hot springs. They built a specialized, enclosed crucible forge, a heavy stone structure designed to trap and intensify heat far beyond a normal blacksmith's hearth. They fed it with coal that Ned had ordered mined from the Grey Cliffs. They attached massive, dual-chambered bellows, manning them with the strongest guards in the castle, who worked in shifts to maintain a relentless, roaring airflow. On the 4th night, the deep vault was sweltering, the air thick and baking. The roar of the forced air was deafening. Ned stripped off his tunic, leaving only his thick breeches, tying his dark hair back with a leather thong. Mikken stood beside him, drenched in sweat, a look of respect and trepidation on his soot-stained face. In the heart of the roaring coals sat a heavy, thick-walled clay crucible. Ned took Red Rain. He removed the ruby-crested hilt and the crossguard, leaving only the bare, rippled tang and blade. Using a pair of long, heavy iron tongs, he slid the Valyrian steel deep into the crucible. "Keep the air flowing," Ned shouted over the roar of the fire. "Do not let the heat drop for a second." The guards hauled on the bellows. The fire turned from orange to a blinding, furious white. Normal steel would glow cherry red, then orange, then white before turning to slag. Valyrian steel was stubborn. It resisted the mundane heat, maintaining its dark, crimson hue for hours. Ned watched through a narrow slit in the forge door, shielding his eyes with smoked glass. He did not use his hidden power. This was a victory of pure, relentless physical labor and architectural design. He relied entirely on the overwhelming temperature they had managed to generate within the enclosed stone hearth. Hours bled by. The heat in the room was agonizing. The guards rotated on the bellows, their muscles screaming. And then, slowly, the ancient metal surrendered. The blade wept. It lost its rigid, sharp shape, slumping into the bottom of the crucible. The dark ripples softened and blurred as the steel finally dissolved into a pool of blinding, white-hot liquid. The crimson taint of its violent past swirled in the molten light, unmoored and formless. "It is ready," Ned shouted. He and Micken moved with practiced, precise speed. They had spent the previous days carving and baking a two-piece casting mold from fine casting sand and clay, shaped precisely to Ned's specifications. Ned grabbed the heavy iron tongs. He reached into the blinding heat of the forge, his skin blistering despite the thick leather gloves. He gripped the edge of the glowing crucible and lifted it from the coals. With extreme care, relying on his natural, heavily conditioned strength, Ned guided the crucible over the pouring hole of the prepared mold. He tipped it. The molten Valyrian steel flowed like glowing water, pouring smoothly into the mold, filling the cavity that would soon become a new blade. They set the crucible aside and stepped back, panting heavily, watching the mold radiate a fierce, angry heat. They waited through the night, allowing the metal to solidify and cool slowly within its clay casing, preventing the magical alloy from fracturing. By dawn, the heat had subsided enough to touch. Ned took a heavy hammer and struck the clay mold. It shattered, falling away in dusty clumps. Resting on the stone table was the rough, unfinished shape of a new sword. Ned lifted the blade with the tongs. He turned to a deep barrel filled with freezing, ice-choked water drawn from the surface wells. He plunged the blade into the water. A massive plume of hissing steam erupted from the barrel, filling the small room with a thick, scalding fog. The water boiled instantly, churning violently as the intense heat of the forged metal was rapidly quenched, locking its temper into place. Ned held it there until the hissing died down, until the water ceased its violent boiling. Slowly, his arms trembling with fatigue, he pulled the blade free. He carried it to the workbench, where Micken was already waiting with the grinding stones and polishing cloths. They worked in silence, stripping away the rough slag and sharpening the edge until it was molecularly thin. Ned stared at what they had created. The crimson tint was entirely gone, burned away or perfectly blended back into the core of the metal. The newly forged blade was a masterpiece of lethal beauty. The steel was dark, almost black, but it caught the ambient light and reflected it in deep, shimmering waves of indigo and pale silver. The rippled patterns were no longer the chaotic swirls of the original forging. They looked like the rolling, freezing waves of the sunset sea crashing against a jagged shoreline. It looked like frozen, violent water captured in iron. Micken attached the new hilt they had prepared, a crossguard of dark, tempered iron shaped elegantly like the cresting waves of the ocean, curving slightly upward to catch an opponent's blade. The pommel was no longer a ruby lion. It was a smooth, polished sphere of pale quartz, resembling a full winter moon. Ned lifted the sword. He had altered the balance completely, crafting a blade slightly wider and significantly lighter than Red Rain, shaping it for a swift, aggressive fighting style tailored perfectly for Benjen's agility. "Winter's tide," Ned rasped, his voice a dry croak in the silent room. He swung the sword through the air, felt completely weightless, whistling with a sharp, deadly hum. He had unraveled the greatest secret of the forge ever known to the world, relying solely on fire, sweat, and ingenuity. He had forged a weapon worthy of the Lord of the Western Fleet. Ned slumped against the workbench, the adrenaline of the long night finally fading, leaving behind a bone-crushing weariness. He looked at the blade resting on the stone. The North had a new sword, and the wolves were ready for the tide. Chapter 67, The Grey Path. The gray light of dawn had barely scratched the eastern horizon when Eddard Stark stepped out of the great keep and into the biting cold of the training yard. The air was sharp, smelling of wood smoke and the promise of impending snow, but the yard was already fully alive with motion. Ned paused on the stone steps, his heavy wolfskin cloak wrapped tight against the morning chill. In the center ring of the yard, 3 small figures were moving through a grueling physical routine under the watchful, uncompromising eye of Arthur Dane. Arthur did not believe in treating highborn children like fragile glass. He wore a simple gray tunic, his breath misting in the freezing air, his posture relaxed but entirely focused. He held a long, smooth ashwood cane, tapping it rhythmically against his boot to keep the time. "Lower, Cregan," Arthur commanded, his voice a calm baritone that carried easily across the packed dirt. "You are lifting with your back, not your legs. If you try to hold a shield wall with that stance, you will be broken in half. Drop your center. Cregan Stark, approaching his 8th name day, gritted his teeth and sank lower into the deep squat. He was holding a thick, waterlogged log across his small shoulders. Sweat beaded on his forehead, mingling with the dirt smudged across his cheek, but he did not complain. He possessed the boundless, stubborn energy of a young wolf, eager to prove his strength. A few paces away, Rhaenys Targaryen, nearing 10 years old, though she was known merely as a highborn ward to the rest of the castle, was executing a series of rapid, side-to-side leaps over a row of low wooden hurdles. She moved with a fluid, natural grace that spoke of her Dornish heritage, her dark curls bouncing with every leap. She was precise, her footwork light and exact, never allowing her boots to drag in the mud. "Keep your eyes forward, Rhaenys," Arthur instructed softly. "Do not look at your feet. Your feet know where the ground is. Look to where the enemy will be." Rhaenys immediately snapped her chin up, her dark, intense eyes fixing on the wooden pell at the far end of the yard, her pace quickening. And then there was Jon. Jon was barely 7, the youngest of the 3, and significantly smaller than his boisterous older brother. Yet, Ned watched him with the keenest interest. Jon was performing the same grueling stamina drills, holding his body rigid as a fallen log above the freezing mud, but his face was completely serene. His dark gray eyes were half closed, his breathing slow and measured. He wasn't fighting the discomfort. He seemed to simply exist alongside it. He possessed a solemn, quiet endurance that was startling for a boy of his years. Arthur tapped his cane twice against the hard earth. "Time," the sword of the morning announced. Cregan dropped the heavy log with a loud thud, letting out a massive, dramatic groan as he collapsed onto his back in the dirt. Rhaenys stopped her bounds, placing her hands on her knees, her breath coming in ragged, visible puffs. Jon simply lowered himself smoothly to the ground, sitting back on his heels and wiping a smear of mud from his brow. "You have 30 heartbeats to catch your breath," Arthur said, walking among them. "Then we begin the sword forms. Today we focus entirely on parrying strikes from a taller opponent." "Uncle Arthur," Cregan wheezed from the ground, "my legs feel like mashed turnips." "Then they will be difficult for an enemy to chop off," Arthur replied effortlessly, offering the faintest hint of a smile. "Up, Cregan. The mud will not make you a better swordsman." Ned stepped down from the stone stairs, his boots crunching loudly on the frosted gravel. "I think that will be enough for the morning, Sir Arthur," Ned called out, his voice a warm, grounding presence in the yard. The 3 children immediately snapped their attention to him. Cregan scrambled to his feet, instantly forgetting his exhaustion. Rhaenys straightened her posture, and Jon stood up quietly. "Father!" Cregan shouted, breaking ranks and running over to wrap his arms around Ned's waist. Ned chuckled, resting a heavy hand on his son's dark curls. "You are covered in mud, Cregan. Your mother will have my hide if I let you into the great hall looking like a swamp creature." "Uncle Arthur says mud builds character," Cregan declared proudly. "Uncle Arthur does not have to answer to Lady Ashera," Ned pointed out dryly, earning a rare, quiet chuckle from the legendary knight. Ned walked forward, placing a hand on Rhaenys' shoulder and offering a fond nod to Jon. He looked at Arthur, seeing the respect and dedication the man poured into training the next generation. "They are progressing well," Ned noted to the knight. "You have them performing the foundational training of the Wolf Guard." "Scaled down, of course," Arthur replied, leaning on his cane. "But yes, if they are to rule, they must know what it means to endure. The boy, Cregan, has immense raw strength. Rhaenys has perfect balance. And Jon." Arthur paused, looking at the quiet boy. "Jon anticipates. Sometimes I think he moves his wooden sword to block a strike before I have even fully decided to swing it." Ned felt a familiar thrill hum through his blood. The spark. "They have learned the discipline of the body," Ned said softly, turning his gaze back to the children. "Now, it is time they learn the discipline of the mind." He looked at the 3 of them. "Leave the practice swords. Come with me." Ned led them away from the clamor of the training yard, past the armory, and through the heavy iron gates that guarded the godswood. The transition was immediate. The harsh clanging of hammers and the shouts of guards vanished, swallowed entirely by the dense, ancient canopy of sentinel trees and towering oaks. The air here was warmer, heated by the deep hot springs that bubbled near the center of the wood, smelling deeply of rich earth, pine needles, and the metallic tang of hot water. The children fell silent, Even Cregan, normally incapable of holding his tongue for more than a minute, seemed to sense the heavy, sacred atmosphere of the place. They walked in a tight group behind Ned, their boots making no sound on the thick carpet of fallen leaves and moss. At the very center of the grove stood the heart tree. The ancient weirwood was a towering behemoth of bone-white bark and blood-red leaves. The face carved into its massive trunk was deeply lined, weeping trails of red sap from its eyes, watching the world with an expression of eternal, sorrowful wisdom. "Sit," Ned instructed, gesturing to the massive, gnarled roots that broke through the soil around the base of the tree. The children obeyed. Cregan sat cross-legged, shifting uncomfortably until he found a soft patch of moss. Rhaenys sat beside him, smoothing her dirt-stained riding leathers with quiet dignity. Jon sat a little to the side, his gray eyes fixed intensely on his father. Ned did not sit. He stood before them, the ancient weirwood looming at his back. He took a long, slow breath, letting the chaotic energy of the castle fade from his mind, tapping into the deep, silent currents of the earth. "You have spent months learning how to swing a sword," Ned began, his voice dropping into a low, resonant cadence that commanded absolute attention. "You have learned how to hold a shield, how to run until your lungs burn, and how to fight through the pain. These are the tools of the physical world. They are necessary." He looked at each of them in turn. "But there is a world beyond the physical. There is an energy that exists behind the swing of the sword, behind the flight of the arrow, behind the very breath in your lungs." Cregan frowned, tilting his head. "Like the old gods, father?" "The old gods are one name for it," Ned said, nodding slowly. "The children of the forest sang to it. The greenseers look through the trees using it. It goes by many names. I simply call it the Force." Rhaenys arched a delicate, dark eyebrow. She was a fiercely intelligent girl, educated by Maester Luwin in histories and sums. "Is it magic, Uncle Ned? Like the tales of the Valyrian dragon lords?" "Magic is a word men use for things they do not yet understand," Ned replied smoothly. "It is not a spell you read from an old book. It is not a potion you brew in a cauldron. It is an energy field. It is created by all living things. It surrounds us, it penetrates us, and it binds the world together." He could see the confusion warring with curiosity in their young faces. They needed to see it. Words were wind. Action was iron. "Watch," Ned commanded softly. He didn't square his shoulders. He didn't chant a mystical phrase. He simply extended his right hand, palm open, toward a small steaming pool of water a few yards away. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second, feeling the swirling currents of the hot spring, the weight of the water, the heat rising into the freezing air. From the surface of the pool, a sphere of water the size of a melon rose smoothly into the air. It did not splash. It did not break apart. It hovered in the space between Ned and the children, perfectly spherical, gently rotating, trailing faint wisps of white steam. Rhaenys gasped loudly, her hands flying to her mouth. Cregan's jaw dropped so far it nearly hit his chest, his eyes bulging as he stared at the impossible sight. Even Jon, who rarely showed overt emotion, leaned forward, his hands gripping his knees tightly as he watched the water dance. Ned moved his hand slowly to the left. The sphere of water followed the motion, drifting silently through the air. With a slight clench of his fist, the sphere suddenly flattened out, stretching into a thin, shimmering ribbon of liquid that spiraled around the trunk of a nearby oak tree like a translucent snake, before Ned simply released his hold. The water lost its cohesion and splashed heavily onto the mossy ground. Silence reigned in the godswood. "What the hells?" Cregan breathed, entirely forgetting the polite language his mother had tried to instill in him. "Cregan," Ned warned mildly. "Sorry," Cregan whispered, completely captivated. He looked up at Ned, absolute awe shining in his eyes. You moved it with your mind, without touching it. You are a sorcerer." "I am a man who has learned to listen," Ned corrected, lowering his hand. "And I am a man who has learned to feel the currents of life." He walked closer to them, crouching down so he was at their level. "You all asked why Arthur is so fast, why he can parry strikes without looking," Ned said gently. "It is because he is beginning to learn this. He is learning to feel the intent of his opponent before the sword even moves. And now, it is time for you to learn." Jon looked up, his gray eyes piercing. "Us? We can do this." "You can," Ned confirmed, looking directly at the quiet boy. All three of you. The blood of the first men runs thick in your veins. The potential is there. It is a spark within you. I am going to teach you how to blow upon that spark until it becomes a fire. Rhaenys looked at her hands, then at the puddle of water on the ground. If we learn this, will we be unstoppable? Like the dragons? The innocence of the question masked a terrifying ambition. Ned knew he had to address the philosophy immediately, before the power corrupted the vessels. Ned sat down on a thick, exposed root, gathering them close. The demonstration was over. Now the true lesson began. Power, Ned said, his voice grave and completely serious, is never a simple thing, Rhaenys. It is not a sword you simply pick up and swing. It is a river, and a river can carve a canyon, or it can drown a city. He picked up a handful of dry, dead leaves from the ground. He crushed them in his fist, letting the fragments fall through his fingers. There are two paths to this power, Ned explained. Two sides of the same coin, the light and the dark. The children leaned in, captivated by the absolute gravity of his tone. There are tales of warrior monks in distant lands who believe that to truly master this power, you must empty yourself of all emotion, Ned said. They believe that anger, fear, and even love are dangerous distractions. They teach that you must become perfectly serene, like a statue carved of white marble. They cast aside their families, their passions, and their attachments to become perfect, unfeeling instruments of peace. Ned looked at Cregan. If I told you that to learn this magic, you could never hug your mother again, or laugh with Jon, what would you say? I would say no, Cregan answered instantly, his face hardening with stubborn, stark loyalty. I would rather have a wooden sword and my mother. Exactly, Ned smiled softly. The extreme light demands the death of the self. A man without love is a man without a reason to fight. It is a sterile, lonely path. We are wolves. We need the pack. He turned his hand over, picking up a sharp, jagged piece of dark flint from the soil. Then there is the other path. The dark. Ned's voice dropped, carrying a chilling warning. The dark path is easy. It is seductive. It tells you that your anger is a weapon. It tells you that your fear can be forged into a shield. It demands that you take your passions and let them consume you entirely. He looked at Rhaenys, thinking of the madness that had consumed her grandfather, Aerys, and the obsession that had doomed her father, Rhaegar. If you let your anger control you, if you use this power to dominate others simply because you can, you will become a monster, Ned warned, his gray eyes locking onto hers. You will be like wildfire, burning everything you touch until there is nothing left but ash. The dark path grants immense, rapid strength, but it twists your soul until you are a slave to your own worst impulses. You become a beast in human skin. Jon frowned, processing the heavy philosophical weight. If we cannot be statues and we cannot be beasts, what are we supposed to be? Ned felt a surge of immense pride for the boy. Jon always sought the core of the matter. We walk the gray path, Ned declared. He held up both hands. We do not cast away our emotions, for they are what make us human. We love our family. We feel anger when the innocent are harmed. We feel fear when the darkness approaches. Ned brought his hands together, clasping them firmly. But we do not let those emotions rule us. We feel them, we acknowledge them, and then we master them. We use the cold of the north to temper the fire in our hearts. We are passionate, but we are controlled. We use this power not to conquer, but to protect. Not to dominate, but to serve. He looked at his three students. The heir to Winterfell, the hidden prince, the disinherited princess. They were children, but they were the foundation of the future. This is the way of the wolf, Ned finished. We balance the light of the sun with the dark of the winter. We walk the line between. Do you understand? We are the shield, Jon said quietly, summarizing perfectly. Yes, Ned nodded. You are the shield. Will you learn this path? I will, Rhaenys said instantly, her chin jutting forward with fierce determination. Me too, Cregan declared, pumping a small fist. Jon simply nodded once, his eyes burning with quiet resolve. Then we begin, Ned said. Close your eyes. The children hesitated for a second, then squeezed their eyes shut. Do not force it, Ned instructed, his voice a low, calming drone that blended with the rustling leaves. Do not try to grab the energy. The harder you grasp, the faster it slips through your fingers. Just breathe. Listen to the wind. Ned stood up and walked slowly around them. Let your awareness expand, Ned guided. Feel the cold air against your cheeks. Feel the damp moss beneath your hands. Feel the solid earth supporting you. You are a part of it, and it is a part of you. He reached out with his own senses, casting a gentle, expansive net over the three children, feeling their spirits. Rhaenys was struggling. She was trying too hard, attempting to force the connection through sheer willpower. Her presence was hot, crackling with frustrated energy. Patience, Rhaenys, Ned murmured, stopping behind her. You are trying to command the river to flow backward. Stop swimming. Just float. She took a deep, shuddering breath, her small shoulders dropping as she consciously released her tension. Slowly, the frantic crackling smoothed out, replaced by a warm, vibrant current of energy. It felt like standing near a well-stoked hearth fire. She had the spark. Cregan was different. His energy was earthy, dense, and grounded. He didn't crackle, he rumbled. He felt like the stone walls of the great keep itself. Solid, immovable, and possessing a vast, unyielding strength. Good, Cregan, Ned praised softly. Feel the roots beneath you. And then, Ned turned his focus to Jon. Ned paused, his breath hitching slightly. Jon was not struggling. Jon was not forcing anything. The boy sat perfectly still, his breathing shallow and even. When Ned touched Jon's spirit, it was breathtaking. It was not a crackling fire or a dense stone. It was a vast, deep, freezing ocean. It was an incredibly potent, pristine connection to the force that felt almost instinctual. Jon was not reaching out to the energy. He was simply allowing it to flow through him, a natural conduit of the world's silent currents. It was an affinity that rivaled, and perhaps exceeded, Ned's own initial potential. The bloodlines combined, Ned thought, a shiver running down his spine. The potential is terrifying. Open your eyes, Ned commanded gently. The three children blinked, looking around the godswood. The world looked the same, but the air felt charged. I felt tingly, Cregan announced, rubbing his arms. Like when my foot falls asleep, but all over. I felt warm, Rhaenys said, looking at her hands in wonder. Jon looked at Ned. I heard the water moving under the ground, he said softly. Before it reaches the pools. It sounds like singing. Ned knelt before Jon, placing a hand on his small shoulder. That is the current, Jon. You are hearing the lifeblood of the world. You all took the first step today. We will practice this every morning. Before the sword, before the sums. We build the mind, then we build the body. Can we lift rocks tomorrow? Cregan asked eagerly. You can try, Ned smiled. But do not be disappointed if they stay on the ground. The river is wide, and you are just learning to swim. He stood up, clapping his hands together. Now the sun is fully up. Arthur expects you in the armory to clean the practice swords. Discipline does not end when the magic begins. Go. The children scrambled up, bowing hastily to Ned before running off toward the heavy iron gates, chattering excitedly among themselves about magic and wolves. Ned watched them go, feeling a profound sense of satisfaction. The foundation was laid. The pack was armed with steel, and soon they would be armed with the very fabric of the world. Later that afternoon, the sun had burned away the morning frost, leaving the air crisp and clear. Ned rode out through the Hunter's Gate, flanked by two members of the Wolf Guard. Riding beside him on a sleek, gray palfrey was Ashera. The Lady of Winterfell wore a heavy cloak of violet wool lined with snow-bear fur, her dark hair braided intricately against the wind. They were not riding into the deep wolfswood for a hunt. They were riding the short distance down the paved avenue that led to the rapidly expanding sprawl of Winter City. The city was a hive of frantic, organized labor. The temporary wooden shacks that had once housed the winter refugees were systematically being torn down, replaced by rows of sturdy, permanent structures. The air smelled of wood smoke, baking bread, and the sharp, alkaline scent of curing mortar. Ned directed their horses toward a large construction site on the eastern edge of the city, near the banks of a small, diverted stream. This was the new residential quarter, specifically designated for the emancipated thralls and salt wives they had brought back from the Iron Islands following the suppression of the Greyjoy Rebellion. Many had chosen to travel further north to the fertile lands of the new gift, but several hundred artisans, weavers, and those too weary to travel further, had chosen to remain in the shadow of Winterfell. Ned and Ashera dismounted, handing their reins to the guards. They walked into the heart of the construction zone. Dozens of men and women, their skin bearing the varied tones of the Iron Islands, the Reach and Essos, were working together with a synchronized, steady rhythm. They were not driven by the crack of a whip or the threat of starvation. They were driven by wages, warm food, and the promise of a hearth that belonged entirely to them. They approached a group of women who were mixing a massive trough of the gray slurry. They were using the crushed volcanic ash shipped from Dragonstone, mixed with local limestone dust and aggregate. It was the poured stone formula Ned had used to pave the King's Road and rebuild Moat Cailin. One of the women, an older, olive-skinned woman who had clearly spent years as a captive salt wife, looked up and saw the Lord and Lady approaching. She hurriedly wiped her hands on a coarse rag and bowed deeply. "Lord Stark, Lady Ashera," the woman said, her Westerosi accented heavily with the cadence of the free cities. "At ease, Miri," Ned said warmly, recognizing the woman. "How goes the pouring?" "It sets fast in the dry cold, my lord," Miri replied, gesturing to the wooden forms holding the thick, gray mud. "It is strange stone. It does not chip like slate. It feels unbreakable. It will keep the winter winds out," Ashera promised, offering the woman a kind smile. "Have the stewards delivered the new wool supplies for your families?" Miri's eyes shone with genuine gratitude. "They have, my lady, the giant's fleece. It is softer than anything we have ever worn. My children sleep soundly through the night. If you need more timber for the roof beams, speak to the foreman," Ned instructed. "The sawmills are running at full capacity. I want these houses roofed and sealed before the heavy snows fall." "You have given us more than timber, Lord Stark," Miri said, her voice thick with emotion. She looked at the sturdy, permanent walls rising around them. "You have given us a place to stand." Ned offered a solemn nod, acknowledging the weight of her words. He and Ashera continued their walk through the growing district. They inspected the newly laid cobblestone streets, the communal bakeries being built with specialized, high-heat brick ovens, and the public bathhouses that would soon be connected to the iron piping network drawing from the hot springs. "You are changing the world, Ned," Ashera murmured, slipping her hand into his as they walked back toward their horses. "One stone at a time." "I am just building a den," Ned said, looking out over the smoking chimneys and the bustling crowds of free people. "A den strong enough to withstand the storm." He looked back toward the towering, ancient walls of Winterfell, feeling the presence of his children practicing their new, impossible skills within the Godswood. The stones were set, the swords were sharp, the mines were opening, the North was ready. Chapter 68: The Southern Echoes. The gardens of Highgarden were a masterpiece of nature bent to the will of man. Fountains sculpted from pale marble sang with falling water, and the air was thick with the intoxicating perfume of 100,000 blooming roses. It was a place of endless summer, a stark contrast to the harsh, unforgiving lands of the north. Lord Mace Tyrell sat at a table of carved wood set beneath a canopy of vibrant green vines, currently devoting his full, undivided attention to a massive platter of roasted quail dripping in a rich plum sauce. He tore a leg from the bird, his thick fingers shining with grease, and took a hearty bite. Across the table sat his mother, Lady Olenna Tyrell. The Queen of Thorns did not partake in the feast. She held a small crystal goblet of arbor gold, her sharp, intelligent eyes fixed on her son, with an expression that hovered somewhere between mild affection and profound disappointment. "And the mud, mother?" Mace complained around a mouthful of meat, wiping his chin with a silk napkin. "You cannot imagine the mud. See Dragon Point. A terrible name for a terrible place. The wind off the sea cut right through my finest velvet cloak. But the feast. I must admit, you would not believe the remarkable things they served." Mace continued, his eyes lighting up, the complaints momentarily forgotten. Instead of plain boiled roots, they brought out earth apples sliced as thin as parchment, fried crisp in tallow until they snapped between your teeth, and heavily salted. And the bread, massive, flat rounds of dough, folded over and stuffed to bursting with melted cheeses, spiced sausages, and crushed garlic. And the fish, perfectly baked cod, swimming in a rich red sauce made from some strange plump sunfruits they claimed to grow in their hot spring gardens. It was extraordinary, mother. I truly enjoyed every bite. I have already told our head cook that we must learn to make those crisp earth apples and that stuffed bread here at Highgarden. We simply must serve them at our next banquet, though they washed it all down with some clear, burning spirit that tasted of pure malice. And not a single proper singer in the entire keep. Just men shouting about bears and wolves. How tragic for you, Mace, Olenna said dryly, taking a delicate sip of her wine. To endure such hardship after merely watching the Northern Fleet do all the actual fighting at Pike. A true hero's trial. Mace missed the sarcasm entirely, taking it as genuine sympathy. He nodded vigorously, reaching for another piece of quail. Exactly, and the sheer folly of the man. Eddard Stark has lost his wits. I assure you. Olenna lowered her goblet, her interest piqued. Folly? Growing sunfruits in the snow and inventing new delicacies sounds like a rather lucrative sort of folly to me. But what else has he done to earn your esteemed judgment? The thralls. Mace laughed. A deep, booming sound that shook his broad belly. When Harlaw and the other islands surrendered, Stark claimed all of their thralls and salt wives. Tens of thousands of them. Instead of leaving them to starve on those miserable rocks, he took them north. Mace took a long gulp of wine, shaking his head. He freed them, mother. He promised them wages and shelter. Can you imagine? The north is a frozen wasteland, and he has just imported 20,000 useless mouths to feed. He will bankrupt Winterfell trying to buy enough grain to keep them alive through the winter. He is an absolute fool. Olenna Tyrell did not laugh. She stared at her son, her mind turning with the sharpness of a master-crafted blade. Where Mace saw a burden of mouths to feed, Olenna saw something far more dangerous. 20,000 pairs of hands, Olenna thought, her grip tightening on the stem of her goblet. Hands to swing pickaxes in the iron mines. Hands to lay stones for his new roads. Hands to stoke the fires of the furnaces. She looked out over the beautiful, soft gardens of her home, a cold knot forming in her stomach. Eddard Stark was not importing mouths. He was importing an empire. He was taking the desperate and the broken and forging them into a fanatically loyal workforce. And in a generation, those workers would have sons, and those sons would be soldiers who owed their very existence to the direwolf. And what of our grain shipments to the north? Olenna asked, her voice sharp. Have the orders increased to account for these useless mouths? Mace frowned, waving a dismissive hand. Strangely, no. The stewards in White Harbor have maintained their usual orders. In fact, they have slightly reduced their purchase of winter wheat. But they are paying a premium for our fruit and citrus, trading it for that strange, clear glass they are making. Olenna closed her eyes for a brief moment. The Reach had always held the north by the throat during the long winters. When the snows buried the northern fields, the lords of Winterfell were forced to empty their vaults to buy Reach grain at exorbitant prices just to keep their people from starving. It was a balance of power that had favored Highgarden for centuries. But now, the north was changing. Olenna had heard the whispers from the merchants. Stark was using strange, heavy iron plows that broke the hard earth. He was rotating crops in a way that defied tradition but yielded massive bounties of strange root vegetables and hardy grains. The north was feeding itself. They were escaping the leash. The wealth of Highgarden was still vast. The Reach was the richest kingdom in the realm, but the hidden currents of power were shifting beneath their feet. Mother, Mace asked, noticing her silence. Is the wine sour? Olenna opened her eyes and looked at the Lord of Highgarden. He was blissfully ignorant, entirely focused on the taste of his plum sauce, completely blind to the changing balance of the realm. The wine is fine, Mace. Olenna sighed, a heavy, tired sound. She glanced toward the high towers of the castle, where her grandson Willis was presumably studying with the maesters. Let the boy have his grandfather's name, she prayed silently to the crone. But please, let him have my mind. Did the Stark boy provide any other amusements to Mock? Olenna asked, trying to glean more information. Nothing of note, Mace scoffed, reaching for a bowl of sugared grapes. He spent most of his time drinking with the king or other lords. Olenna nodded, looking away. The fat flower had noticed nothing of value. The Lion's Watch. High above the sunset sea, the air in Casterly Rock was cool and carrying the faint, bitter scent of charred timber. Tywin Lannister stood on the balcony of his massive solar, looking down at the city of Lannisport. The harbor, once a forest of proud masts and golden sails, was a blackened, ruined scar. The shipyards were nothing but ash and scorched stone. The Greyjoy rebellion had been crushed, but the wound Euron crows I had inflicted upon the pride of House Lannister still bled. The debris has been cleared from the deep water channels, my lord, Kevin Lannister reported, standing dutifully behind his older brother. The master builders have laid the keels for the first 10 galleys. We have doubled the wages for shipwrights to draw them from the Arbor and Gulltown, but it will be years before the fleet is fully restored. See that it is done faster, Kevin, Tywin said, his voice flat and uncompromising. Spare no expense. We will not be caught defenseless by sea ever again. Have you secured the Greyjoy boy? Theon is settled in the lower wards, Kevin confirmed. He is terrified. He cries for his mother. Let him cry, Tywin commanded, turning away from the balcony to face the room. But do not let him wallow. Break his ironborn pride. Strip away the salt and the brine. I want him dressed in crimson, taught by our masters at arms, and instructed in the true cost of defying this house. When the time comes to return him to Pike, he will be a lion in a kraken's skin. He will answer to Casterly Rock. It will be done, Tywin, Kevin nodded. The heavy oak doors of the solar swung open, and Ser Jaime Lannister strode into the room. He wore a finely tailored tunic of crimson and gold, his golden hair catching the light. He looked relaxed, the burden of the white cloak finally lifted from his shoulders. Father, Uncle, Jaime greeted them, pouring himself a cup of arbor gold from a crystal decanter. I have returned from the frozen wedding. So you have, Tywin said, taking his seat behind the massive desk of polished weirwood. Did Lord Stark put on a suitable display for the king? He put on a display, certainly, Jaime smirked, sitting in a plush chair and stretching his legs out, though not the kind you might expect. The castle at Sea Dragon Point is formidable, but it was the games that caught Robert's attention. Games? Tywin asked, his eyes narrowing slightly. A tourney, no jousting. The Northmen consider it a vanity, Jaime explained, taking a sip of his wine. They play in the mud. 2 games. One they call the Shield Wall, where 30 men lock arms and attempt to shove each other across a line. The other is a chaotic scramble involving a heavy leather ball, passing it backward while running. The king was absolutely enthralled. He actually stripped off his royal doublet and anchored the Stark line in the mud himself. Kevin frowned. The king lowered himself to wrestle with common men-at-arms? Robert is Robert, Jaime shrugged. He claimed it was the most fun he has had since the rebellion. He boasted to anyone who would listen that he intends to bring these games south. He wants to host a grand tournament in King's Landing, inviting all the kingdoms to compete. While Jaime spoke with casual amusement, Tywin Lannister's mind seized upon the details like a steel trap. Tywin did not see peasant revelry. He saw the true foundation of a military genius. Men locking arms without weapons, pushing as a single mass, moving a heavy object through hostile territory while maintaining formation and speed. It is not a game, Tywin stated, his voice dropping into a low, dangerous register. Jaime looked at his father, confused. It looked very much like a game, father. They cheered and drank afterward. It is a drill, Tywin corrected coldly. It is conditioning for the foot soldiers disguised as sport. Stark is training his bannermen to move in absolute unity. He is building unbreakable lines, testing his captain's ability to command under pressure, and hardening his soldiers' endurance, all without shedding a single drop of blood or risking a steel blade. Kevin's eyes widened as the realization hit him. He is preparing his levies for war while calling it a festival. Precisely, Tywin said, leaning forward. And if the king intends to bring these games south, House Lannister will not be humiliated in the mud before the entire realm. We will not allow the North to demonstrate martial superiority in any arena. Tywin looked at Jaime. You will assemble a team. Select the largest, most disciplined men in our vanguard. You will train them in these maneuvers. Jaime let out a sharp laugh, holding up his hands. Me? Father, I am a knight. My skill is with a sword on horseback. I have no interest in leading a dozen sweaty men in a pushing match in the dirt. It is beneath me. Tywin's green eyes hardened into chips of emerald. He stared at his golden heir, disappointed but unwilling to force the issue and risk driving Jaime away so soon after retrieving him. Very well, Tywin said icily. If the Golden Lion is too proud for the mud, I will find someone who is accustomed to the dirt. Tywin turned his gaze to Kevin. Send for Tyrion. Jaime blinked in surprise. Tyrion? You want to put him in charge of a physical competition. Your brother is stunted in body, but he possesses a mind for puzzles and a certain low cunning, Tywin said, his lip curling slightly with distaste at the mere mention of his youngest son. He reads ancient histories of military formations while you practice your sword thrusts. If this game requires tactical coordination and the exploitation of leverage, the dwarf will deduce the mechanics of it. Let him select the men. Let him train them. It will give him a purpose and keep him out of the brothels of Lannisport. He will likely enjoy it, Kevin noted quietly. See that he takes it seriously, Tywin commanded. When the king calls for this tournament, the crimson and gold will not yield a single inch of ground. A few hours later, Tyrion Lannister sat in the corner of a high-end tavern in Lannisport, a cup of spiced wine in hand and an agreeable young woman on his lap, when his uncle's guards delivered the summons. "My father wants me to do what?" Tyrion asked, his mismatched eyes blinking in disbelief at the crimson-cloaked captain. "Command a team of men in a mud-shoving contest, my lord," the knight repeated, looking thoroughly uncomfortable delivering the message to the halfman. Tyrion burst into a fit of laughter, nearly spilling his spiced wine over his velvet tunic. The woman on his lap giggled, though she had no idea what was so funny. "Oh, the sheer, brilliant poetry of it," Tyrion gasped, hopping down from his chair with a wicked grin spreading across his face. "The dwarf commands the giants. My father's spite truly knows no bounds, yet he hands me a fascinating puzzle." Tyrion drained his cup and tossed a gold coin onto the table. "Very well, sir," Tyrion said, his mind already calculating the mechanics of leverage and the balance of weight required for such a contest. "Tell my loving father I accept his gracious command. And tell the master-at-arms I require the 20 largest, meanest, thickest-skulled brutes in the Westerlands to report to me by dawn. If we are to play the wolf's game, we shall play it with monsters." Far to the south, the heat of Dorne baked the pale stones of the water gardens. Prince Doran Martell sat in his wheeled chair beneath the shade of a silken canopy, a blanket draped over his swollen, aching joints. He watched the children splashing in the cool pools, listening to their carefree laughter. Footsteps approached, light and purposeful. Prince Oberyn, the Red Viper, stepped under the canopy, wearing light silks of sun yellow and vibrant orange. "You summoned me, brother?" Oberyn asked, taking a seat on a nearby cushioned bench. "I have been reflecting on the northern wedding," Doran said slowly, his voice calm and measured. "Particularly the new contests Lord Stark has devised." Oberyn grinned, a sharp, dangerous expression. "They are brutal affairs, Doran. Fascinating to watch. The Northerners hurl themselves at each other with the ferocity of cornered beasts, yet they maintain a rigid, unbreakable discipline. It requires immense strength and speed, according to your description of the second game," Doran noted, looking at the water. "The one involving the leather ball. Indeed, the Mormonts won that match using pure agility and swift flanking. They made the giant Umbers look like lumbering fools." Doran steepled his fingers, his dark eyes thoughtful. "Eddard Stark is a man who thinks 10 steps ahead of his peers," Doran murmured. "He pacifies his lords with wealth, and he hardens his soldiers with sport. King Robert is a loud, boastful man. He will inevitably demand these games be played in the capital to entertain himself." Doran turned to look directly at Oberyn. "When that day comes, Dorne will participate, but we will not fight like Northerners. We will not attempt to be a wall of ice." Oberyn leaned forward, his warrior's blood stirring at the prospect. "How then, brother?" "We are the sun and the spear," Doran said softly. "We are the desert wind. I want you to select a team, Oberyn. Do not pick the heaviest men. Pick the fastest. Pick the men who can endure the heat, who can slip through a closing gap before it forms. Train them to strike and fade, to use the enemy's weight against them." Oberyn's grin widened into a predatory smile. "A team of vipers. We will run circles around the heavy knights of the Stormlands and the West." "Precisely," Doran nodded. "Let them see the speed of Dorne. Keep the men ready. When the stag calls, the sun will answer." In the heart of the Riverlands, the Red Fork flowed swiftly past the massive sandstone walls of Riverrun. Lord Hoster Tully sat in his private solar, surrounded by stacks of parchment and heavy leather-bound ledgers. He rubbed his tired eyes, reviewing the latest trade reports from the northern merchants. The Riverlands remained prosperous and fertile, but Hoster had noted a distinct shift in the flow of coin. The massive, highly lucrative shipments of winter grain that usually traveled up the King's Road to feed the north had dwindled to a fraction of their former volume. Lord Stark's new farming methods were clearly succeeding. However, the loss in grain coin was somewhat offset by the tariffs collected from the barges moving northern glass and clear spirits south through the Trident. The Blackfish, Ser Brynden Tully, walked into the solar, his scale armor clinking softly. "The perimeter patrols are complete, Hoster," Brynden reported. "The river roads are quiet. The realm is at peace." "Good," Hoster grunted, setting his quill down. "We have enough to manage without worrying about bandits." Brynden stepped further into the room, leaning his hands upon the polished surface of his brother's desk. "Hoster, about what we witnessed at Sea Dragon Point, the king's new obsession. Robert boasted he would hold a grand contest in the capital. It might be wise to at least prepare a few men, lest Riverrun look foolish when the Raven arrives." Hoster waved a hand in dismissal. "We watched the king of the Seven Kingdoms roll in the freezing mud like a common foot soldier. It is a peasant's game, Brynden. A child's brawl in the dirt. There is no need for such folly here." "It builds endurance," Brynden countered mildly, ever the veteran commander. "It tests unit cohesion and discipline without shedding blood." "We are knights of the Riverlands," Hoster stated stubbornly. "We fight on horseback with lance and sword. I will not waste the time of my masters at arms training men to push each other in the mud. If Robert wishes to play the fool, he may do so with the Northmen. We have actual trade to manage and real borders to patrol." Brynden sighed, recognizing the intractable stubbornness of his older brother. The Lord of Riverrun saw only the mud, entirely blind to the martial value hidden within the sport. "As you say, Hoster," Brynden conceded. But as the Blackfish left the solar and walked out into the courtyard of Riverrun, he stopped to watch the knights practicing their pristine, rigid lance charges against wooden targets. It was stagnant. It was foolish. Brynden Tully had fought enough battles to know that wars were rarely won from the back of a horse on a perfectly flat field. Brynden caught the eye of a scarred, veteran captain of the guards and waved him over. "Find me 30 men," the Blackfish ordered quietly, ensuring no squires were listening. "Not knights. Men-at-arms. Broad shoulders, thick legs, and hard heads. We are marching to the muddy banks of the Red Fork every morning at dawn." The captain raised an eyebrow. "Muddy banks, Ser Brynden? Whatever for?" "And if my brother asks," Brynden continued, ignoring the question with a sharp grin, "tell him we are training to hunt river bandits." In the Red Keep of King's Landing, the air was thick with the smell of incense and roasting boar. King Robert Baratheon sat in his private chambers, a massive flagon of winter's breath resting on the table before him. He was in high spirits, regaling Jon Arryn with exaggerated tales of his trip to the north for the 3rd time that week. "I tell you, Jon, you should have come to the coast," Robert boomed, pouring himself a generous measure of the clear spirit. "The Stark boy, Benjen, he runs a tight keep. And the games, gods. The thrill of holding that line against the Umbers. It was pure strength, Jon. No hiding behind a horse or a lance. Just men proving their worth." Jon Arryn smiled indulgently, looking over a stack of tax decrees he needed the king to sign. "I am glad you found enjoyment in the north, your grace. But we must address the funding for the new city watch barracks." "The barracks can wait," Robert interrupted, waving a heavy hand. "I have decided, Jon. We are going to build a playing field here, right outside the walls of the Red Keep, beneath the shadow of the hills. I want a grand contest of the shield wall." Sitting in the shadows of the room, listening to the king's booming voice, was Queen Cersei Lannister. She wore a gown of rich crimson, her golden hair perfectly coiled. She stared at Robert's broad back, a cool, detached smile touching her lips. "Clear the fields," Robert bellowed, pacing the room, entirely consumed by his new obsession. "Bring in heavy dirt and mark the lines. I want a proper northern bog right outside my city. We will command every kingdom to send their best 15 men. I will lead the Crownlands myself. It will be glorious." Cersei's green eyes watched him with quiet disdain. She despised his crude, boisterous nature. She despised how he constantly sought to relive his glory days in the mud. And she certainly held no love for the North or Eddard Stark, the stoic phantom who held her husband's absolute loyalty. Yet, she felt no rage at this new pursuit. In fact, she welcomed it. Let him build his mud pit, Cersei thought, rising gracefully from her chair and sweeping out of the room without a word. Let him roll in the dirt like a swine. As long as he is distracted by his peasant brawls and his cups, the real power remains free for those willing to wield it in the shadows. Jon Arryn, ever the pragmatist, merely nodded at the king's enthusiastic plans, sighing internally at the cost of moving that much dirt. He saw the games as a harmless distraction, a way to channel Robert's aggressive energy into something that did not involve starting a real war or bankrupting the treasury with massive jousting tournaments. I will instruct the master builders to begin clearing the grounds tomorrow, Your Grace. Jon Arryn agreed smoothly, completely failing to grasp the tactical advantage the games provided, his mind entirely consumed by the crushing burdens of ruling a fractured realm. The pieces were set. In the north, the wolves continued their relentless conditioning. In the west, the dwarf began to study the mechanics of the wall. In the south, the vipers practiced their speed. Hidden in the rivers, the trout learned to hold the mud. And in the center, the king eagerly awaited his chance to brawl. The future battlefields of Westeros were already being drawn, masked behind the guise of a festival game. Chapter 69, The Whispers and the Amberfire are 18. It had been a moon since Eddard Stark had ridden through the Hunter's Gate, returning the Warden of the North to the ancient halls of Winterfell. The transition from warlord to ruler was swift, his days consumed by the heavy burdens of settling the freed thralls and overseeing the vast expansion of the Winter City. But his nights belonged entirely to the Wolf's Den. For the past several nights, Ned had retreated early to the heavy oak doors of his private bedchamber, seeking the profound solace he could only find there. Outside the thick granite walls of the great keep, the wind howled like a starved beast, driving sheets of blinding white snow against the high windows. Inside, however, the world was a furnace. The heavy iron pipes hidden within the stone walls radiated a steady, comforting heat drawn from the deep hot springs, while a massive fire roared in the wide hearth, casting the room in a rich, dancing glow of orange and gold. Ned lay on his back in the center of the massive, fur-laden bed. The heavy pelts of snow bears and shadowcats had been pushed down to the foot of the mattress, rendered entirely unnecessary by the heat of the room and the heat of the bodies intertwined upon the sheets. He was as naked as the day he was born, his broad chest rising and falling in a slow, contented rhythm. His skin was smooth and unmarred by the deep, jagged marks of war. No enemy blade had ever been swift enough or skilled enough to land a life-threatening blow against him, leaving his heavy, iron-hard musculature a flawless testament to his unmatched martial prowess. To his left, curled intimately against his side, lay Ashera. Her midnight dark hair spilled across his chest like a shadow, her smooth, pale leg tangled with his own. She was tracing absent-minded, feather-light circles over his heart with her index finger, her breathing soft and relaxed. To his right, resting her head in the crook of his shoulder, lay Elia Martell. The Princess of Dorne looked nothing like the frail, terrified captive he had rescued from the Red Keep years ago. Her olive skin glowed with health and the flush of their recent exertions. Her dark eyes, usually sharp and calculating, were half-closed in absolute, languid satisfaction. They had just finished their nightly activities, an exhausting stretch of passion that left them all pleasantly drained. It was a private, fiercely guarded dynamic that existed only behind these locked doors. In the light of day, Ashera was the radiant lady of Winterfell, and Elia was the honored royal guest. But in the dark, they were simply his. "You have been insatiable since you returned from the coast, my lord," Ashera murmured, her voice a low, husky purr that vibrated against his chest. "I have been absent too long," Ned replied, his voice a deep rumble, resting his hand on the curve of her bare hip. "A man must ensure his own hearth is properly tended." Elia let out a soft, breathy laugh, tilting her head up to press a lingering kiss to the strong, rough line of his jaw. "If you tend to your borders with half the vigor you tend to your bed, Lord Stark, the Ironborn will never dare sail their ships out of port again." Ned smiled, closing his eyes and letting the sheer, unadulterated comfort of the moment wash over him. But the peace of the pack was built upon vigilance, and the women beside him were the chief architects of his awareness. The heavy, warm contentment slowly began to recede, replaced by the sharp, calculating focus of the great game. "The storm outside is fierce," Elia noted, her tone shifting seamlessly from the sensual to the practical. She propped herself up on one elbow, entirely unashamed of her nakedness in the firelight. "But it is nothing compared to the storms brewing in the south. The ravens from our spy networks have been busy while you were occupied with your forging." Ned opened his eyes, shifting his weight slightly to look at the princess. "Tell me." Ashera shifted as well, sitting up and pulling a thick, white wolf pelt over her lap, though she left her upper half bare to the warmth of the hearth. "Your assessment of Lord Tywin was correct," Ashera began, her violet eyes glinting. "He returned directly to Casterly Rock. The burning of his fleet has enraged him, He has been hiring every shipwright from Lannisport to Old Town to rebuild his strength. Let him build, Ned scoffed softly. We heard whispers of your shield wall and the charge, Elia added, trailing a finger lightly down Ned's arm. It seems the old lion recognized the martial value in your drills. He intends to field a team. And who commands it? Ned asked. Jaime? No, Ashera smiled. He refuses to lower his own knights to the dirt. He has formally assigned the duty of assembling and training the Westerlands team to his youngest son, Tyrion. Ned raised an eyebrow, genuinely intrigued. The dwarf. Yes, Elia nodded. Our spies report Lord Tywin gave the command as a mockery, expecting his stunted son to fail at managing a host of massive brutes. Ned considered this. Tywin's arrogance blinds him to his own blood. Tyrion lacks physical stature, but his mind is sharper than a honed blade. He understands how to use a man's weight against him. If Tywin thinks he has set the boy up to fail, he is mistaken. A team commanded by Tyrion Lannister will be a cunning opponent. Ashera nodded in agreement. And what of our glorious king? She asked, looking at Elia. King Robert has returned to the capital, Elia reported, a delicate snort of amusement escaping her. And he is entirely obsessed. The moment he arrived, he ordered the master builders to clear a massive tract of land just outside the city walls, near the old tourney grounds. He is having them dig trenches, fill them with heavy clay, and lay down boundaries. He is hell-bent on this tournament. Robert needs a war to feel alive, Ned said, feeling a familiar pang of sympathy for his old friend. If he does not have a real enemy to smash, he will use a game that allows him to brawl. It keeps him distracted. The games have taken root in the rivers as well, Elia continued, her dark eyes sparkling. Hoster Tully refused to participate, calling it a peasant's folly, but Ser Brynden did not. The Blackfish is taking heavily built men-at-arms into the marshes at dawn. He claims they are hunting river bandits, but they return covered in mud, moving in tight shield formations. He is secretly preparing a team right under his brother's nose. Ned let out a low, appreciative chuckle. Brynden Tully is a true commander. He knows that wars are won by the infantry's endurance. And Dorne, I received a coded message from Sunspear, Elia said, a touch of Dornish pride warming her tone. Oberyn is gathering the swiftest, most agile spearmen in the deep deserts. They are practicing running on shifting dunes to build their balance. Dorne will not bring a wall of ice to the King's tournament, Lord Stark. We will bring the desert wind. Ned fell silent for a moment, processing the intelligence. The realm was quietly arming itself for a mock war. And the rest? Ned asked, looking between the two women. What of the Vale? The Stormlands? The Reach? Ashera shook her head gently. The Vale is silent. Lord Aaron is entirely consumed with managing the King's ledgers and the realm. He has no time to spare for assembling a team. And Lord Stannis? Ned inquired. Does the Master of Ships prepare his men? Lord Stannis divides his time between his seat at Storm's End and his duties with the royal fleet, Elia reported smoothly. He views the entire endeavor as a frivolous waste of time and resources. He does not even know the rules of the games, nor does he care to learn them. The Stormlands will likely not field a unified host unless the king directly orders it. That leaves the Reach, Ned said, his brow furrowing slightly. Lord Randall Tarly watched our Wolfguard train at Sea Dragon Point. I know he recognized the value of the physical conditioning. Lord Tarly is indeed using your conditioning exercises, Ned, Ashera said. He has the vanguard of Horn Hill running with heavy sacks. But they are not training for the games. They are simply training for war. Highgarden is not preparing a team. Why? Ned asked, genuinely confused. With the wealth and manpower of the Reach, they could dominate the field. Ashera and Elia exchanged a brief, highly amused glance before Ashera let out a musical chuckle. Because, Elia explained, a wide smile breaking her regal composure. In order to field a team, the Lord of Highgarden must first authorize it. And it seems Lord Mace Tyrell entirely forgot to mention the King's Grand Tournament to his mother. Ned stared at them. He forgot? How do you forget the king declaring a contest of all the kingdoms? According to our spies in the Highgarden kitchens, Ashera laughed. When Lord Mace returned from your brother's wedding, he spoke of absolutely nothing but the food. He spent 3 days raving to the Queen of Thorns about your fried earth apples, the savory meat pies, and the stuffed bread. He was so completely obsessed with recreating your northern menu that the King's Tournament entirely slipped his mind. Ned blinked, processing the sheer, unfathomable gluttony of the man. Then, he let out a deep, rich laugh rumbled up from his chest, joining the laughter of his women. The Queen of Thorns is going to be absolutely furious when the royal decrees are sent out and she realizes the Reach is a year behind in training. Ned chuckled, shaking his head. Mace Tyrell, defeated by a baked apple. The laughter slowly subsided, the fire crackling merrily in the hearth, filling the silence. Ned's expression gradually sobered. He had enjoyed the news of the games, but there was a far darker, heavier piece of intelligence he needed to address. And what of across the narrow sea? Ned asked, his voice dropping an octave, the levity completely gone. What of the Targaryen exiles? Viserys and Daenerys? Alia's face instantly lost its humor. The mention of her late husband's siblings was a complex, painful subject. She sat up straighter, her dark eyes turning grave. They remain in Bravos, Elia reported, her tone strictly professional. Sir Willem Darry is an old man, and sick, but he is fiercely loyal. He protects them in a house with a red door. They live quietly. They are not gathering armies or seeking sellswords. Ashera reached out, resting a gentle hand on Alia's arm, before looking at Ned. I am sending coin from time to time to Sir Willem, Ashera confessed softly, watching Ned's eyes. Unmarked silver, moved quietly through our merchants. It is not enough to hire a mercenary or buy a ship. It is only enough to ensure the old knight can afford firewood, food, and warm clothes for the children. Ned looked at the fierce, uncompromising compassion of his wife. He offered a slow, approving nod. I do not mind, Ashera. We do not war on babes. Let them have warm food. Elia let out a quiet breath of relief, but Ned kept his gaze fixed on her. He had to know the state of the bloodline. Sir Willem is a good man, Ned said slowly, but he is raising the son of the Mad King. Tell me the truth, Elia. Is there madness in the boy? Elia looked away, staring into the roaring flames of the hearth. The firelight caught the profound sadness in her eyes. He is only a child, Ned, Elia whispered, her voice thick with sorrow. But, yes, the spies report disturbing behavior. He is prone to sudden, violent fits of rage. He is cruelly possessive of his infant sister. He speaks constantly of waking the dragon, and of burning those who wronged his family. The coin keeps them fed, but it cannot buy the boy a sane mind. The initial signs of the rot are already there. Ned gave a slow, grim nod. Viserys Targaryen was breaking before he ever had a chance to grow. We will continue to watch him, Ned stated firmly, but until he becomes a true threat to the peace of the realm, they remain ghosts. Ned rose from the bed with predatory grace, his bare feet silent on the warm stone floor. He crossed to the oak sideboard, where a square bottle of Northern Fire, his finest triple-distilled whiskey, gleamed like captured sunlight. Chapter 70, The Pups of Winter. The castle of Winterfell was submerged in the deep, breathless silence that belonged only to the wolf hour. The sky outside the thick glass windows was a bruised, absolute black, blanketed by the heavy clouds of the turning season. In the boys' chambers, the hearth fire had burned down to a dull, glowing ember. Cregan Stark, 9 years old and already possessing the broad shoulders of his father's line, lay sprawled across his massive featherbed. His blankets were kicked entirely off, one leg hanging over the side, a soft, rhythmic snore rumbling in his chest. From the far side of the room, a smaller shadow sat perfectly upright. Jon Stark did not snore. At 8 years old, he possessed a stillness that was unnerving to the castle servants but perfectly natural to him. He was already awake, sitting cross-legged on his woven rug, his dark gray eyes open and fixed on the dying embers. He didn't feel the chill of the stone floor. He was already breathing in the slow, measured cadence his father had taught them. The heavy iron bell in the distant courtyard tolled once. A low, mournful clong that signaled the changing of the night watch. Jon stood up smoothly, making absolutely no sound. He walked over to Cregan's bed and reached out, shaking his older brother's shoulder. Cregan snorted, jerking his leg back, his eyes snapping open. I'm awake. I'm holding the line, he mumbled, still half-trapped in a dream of the shield wall. The line is fine, Cregan, Jon whispered, his voice quiet and calm. It is time for the woods. Cregan groaned, scrubbing his hands over his face. It's freezing, Jon. Can't we tell father the trees are sleeping today? The trees never sleep. A sharp, melodic voice whispered from the doorway. Rainey stood in the hall, her silhouette framed by the flickering torchlight of the corridor. At 11, she was growing tall and graceful, possessing the dark, olive-skinned beauty of her Dornish mother but carrying herself with a fierce, uncompromising pride. She wore dark, fitted riding leathers lined with pale wolf fur. Are you going to lay there complaining like a Southron merchant, Cregan? Or are we going? Rainey's challenged, a teasing smirk on her lips. I'm coming, Cregan grumbled, throwing his legs over the side of the bed and shivering as the cold air hit him. He quickly pulled on his heavy wool trousers and a thick tunic, grabbing his fur-lined cloak from the back of a chair. The three children moved through the corridors of the great keep like shadows. They knew exactly which floorboards creaked and which stones were loose. They slipped past the sleeping guards with practiced ease, descending the spiral stairs and stepping out into the biting cold of the courtyard. The snow crunched beneath their boots as they walked toward the heavy iron gates of the Godswood. When they passed the threshold, the harsh wind of the courtyard vanished, replaced by the dense, ancient quiet of the sentinel trees. The air here was warmer, heated by the subterranean hot springs that bubbled near the center of the grove, filling the air with a faint, metallic mist. Eddard Stark was already there. He sat upon the massive, gnarled roots of the heart tree, wearing a simple gray tunic despite the freezing temperature. His eyes were closed, his breathing indistinguishable from the rustling of the blood-red leaves above him. The children arranged themselves in a semicircle before him, sitting on patches of damp moss. They didn't speak. They didn't announce their arrival. They simply fell into the rhythm of the grove. Breathe, Ned's voice rumbled, so quiet it seemed to come from the wood itself rather than his chest. The lesson began. This was the discipline of the mind, the foundation of their hidden power. Ned did not teach them to lift boulders or summon lightning. He taught them control. Do not reach out to grab the world, Ned instructed, his eyes still closed. Let the world wash over you. Feel the current. Find your center. Cregan scrunched his face in concentration. His spirit was dense and earthy. He struggled with the subtle aspects of the energy, his mind instinctively wanting to build walls rather than open doors. Relax your jaw, Cregan, Ned murmured, sensing the boy's frustration without looking. You are trying to fight the cold. The cold is a fact. Accept it. Let it pass through you. Cregan let out a long breath, dropping his shoulders. Slowly, his jagged, frustrated energy smoothed out, settling into a heavy, immovable stillness. Rainey's was the opposite. Her energy was a crackling, vibrant fire. She didn't want to sit still. She wanted to act. Listen to the water, Rainey's, Ned guided her. Not the fire in your blood. The water in the springs. It flows. It finds the path of least resistance. Channel the heat into the flow. Rainey's took a deep, shuddering breath. The air around her calmed down, focusing into a sharp, precise point of awareness. And John simply belonged here. He sat perfectly straight, his face a mask of absolute serenity. His connection to the silent currents of the earth was vast and deep, a pristine, freezing ocean that swallowed all noise and distraction. Open your eyes, Ned commanded softly. The three children blinked, the gloom of the gods would coming back into focus. Ned held out his right hand, palm up. Resting in the center of his calloused palm were three distinct, blood-red leaves from the weirwood canopy. Focus, Ned said. He didn't move his hand, but the three leaves slowly rose into the air, hovering an inch above his skin. Take them, Ned instructed. Just 1 inch. Cregan went first. He stared at the leaf on the left. He imagined an invisible hand grabbing it. The leaf twitched, shuddered violently, and then flipped over on Ned's palm without lifting. Too heavy, Ned corrected gently. You are pulling a wagon, not lifting a feather. Try again. Then, after a few tries, Cregan was successful. Then Ned looks at Rainey's. Rainey's focused on the leaf on the right. She didn't grab. She commanded. The leaf rose 1/2 inch, fluttering unsteadily as if caught in a frantic breeze, before falling back down. Better, Ned nodded. But your intent is loud. It disturbs the air around it. He looked at John. John didn't stare intently. He simply looked at the middle leaf, holding his own small hand out. The leaf drifted upward. It shook slightly, vibrating with the sheer effort the young boy was putting into the task. It hovered for 3 seconds, barely an inch off Ned's palm, before Jon lost his grip and the leaf dropped back to the skin. Jon let out a tired breath. "Good," Ned praised quietly. "You are all at the very beginning of the river. Takes years to learn to swim. Do not rush the current." For more than an hour, they remained in the Godswood, practicing the delicate art of feeling the world around them, until the first light of dawn finally turned the eastern sky the color of bruised iron. Ned stood up, brushing a patch of snow from his knees. "The mind is awake," Ned declared, looking down at his 3 pups. "Now go break your fast. You have a long day ahead of you. Physical training with Arthur begins as soon as you wipe the porridge from your chins." The family broke their fast in the private solar, devouring thick cuts of bacon and steaming oat porridge with the ravenous hunger of growing wolves. The moment their bowls were scraped clean, the children were marched out into the freezing reality of the training yard. The yard was a desolate expanse of churned, semi-frozen mud. Arthur Dane stood waiting for them, leaning casually on a smooth ashwood cane. He wore simple boiled leather, his breath misting rhythmically in the chill air. "Cloaks off," Arthur commanded. "You cannot build endurance wrapped in a blanket." For the next 2 hours, Arthur subjected them to the grueling physical training Lord Stark had devised. They did not touch a wooden sword. Instead, they ran long sprints across the mud with heavy hemp sacks of wet sand slung over their shoulders. They performed rapid, explosive push-ups until their arms shook, and held agonizing squats until their legs felt like lead. Arthur didn't coddle them. He demanded perfection in their forms, correcting a slumped back or a shallow stance with a sharp tap of his cane. He knew the unyielding strength built here in the mud would save their lives on a battlefield years from now. When the midday bell finally tolled, the 3 children lay flat on their backs in the churned earth, completely and utterly spent. "Good work," Arthur praised quietly, looking down at them. "Go wash. Feed yourselves. I will see you back here this evening for the steel." By mid-afternoon, the harsh physical training of the morning was done. The children had devoured their lunches like starving hounds, and the castle had settled into a comfortable, busy rhythm. The heavy oak door to the Lord's private solar was slightly ajar. Inside, Eddard Stark, Lord of Winterfell and Warden of the North, was engaged in the most serious parley of his week. He was sitting cross-legged on a plush Myrish rug near the roaring hearth fire. Across from him sat 3-year-old Sansa Stark. She was meticulously arranging a set of tiny, intricately carved wooden teacups on a small wooden tray. "You must hold it carefully, father," Sansa instructed seriously, handing Ned a thimble-sized wooden cup. "It is very hot. It is lemon tea." "I see," Ned said gravely, accepting the tiny cup between his large, calloused thumb and forefinger. He brought it to his lips and took a highly exaggerated, imaginary sip. "An excellent vintage, Lady Sansa. The lemons are particularly fresh." Sansa beamed, pouring herself an imaginary cup from a wooden pitcher. "Mama said the lemons come from Dorne." At the edge of the rug, a blur of chaotic energy was currently laying siege to the furniture. Arya Stark, barely a year and a half old, was running in wide circles around the heavy weirwood desk. She possessed the untamed spirit of the wolf blood, armed with a wooden spoon that she was occasionally using to smack the legs of the chairs. "Rawr!" Arya shrieked, her dark hair a tangled mess, charging past Ned's back. "Careful, little wolf," Ned chuckled, reaching out to lightly catch Arya around the waist as she ran by, bringing her to a halt. Arya immediately squirmed, giggling wildly, and whacked his knee with her spoon before tearing off toward the bookshelves. Watching from the comfortable armchairs near the window were the true rulers of the household. Aishera sat gracefully, holding the newest addition to the pack, baby Ricard, who was fast asleep against her shoulder. Elia Martell sat beside her, sipping a cup of warm spiced wine, while Anna leaned against the windowsill, wiping a smudge of dirt from her cheek. "He is entirely at their mercy," Elia noted with a soft, amused smile, watching the fearsome Lord Stark carefully set his tiny teacup down so Sansa could refill it. "He prefers it that way," Aishera laughed quietly, gently patting Ricard's back. "He spent a year commanding armies. Now he takes orders from a 3-year-old. As he should," Anna chimed in, grinning. "It builds character. Keep him in line, Sansa." "I am trying, Aunt Anna," Sansa replied politely, entirely focused on her tea party. "But Arya is being very loud." "Arya is practicing her battle cries," Ned defended his youngest daughter, wincing slightly as the toddler collided heavily with a stack of ledgers, knocking them over with a loud thud. While the younger children occupied the solar, the older pups had business elsewhere. The harsh exertions of the morning left a permanent, gnawing hunger in the bellies of growing wolves. Cregan, Rhaenys, and Jon stood huddled in the shadows of the corridor, just outside the great kitchens. The smell of roasting meat and baking bread wafted heavily into the hall, making their mouths water. "Gage is busy by the roasting spits," Cregan whispered, peering around the stone corner. The head cook was currently yelling at a scullery boy about the proper rotation of a pig. "The sweet rolls are on the cooling rack near the pantry door. I can see them. If we get caught, Lady Ashera will make us scrub the kennels," Rhaenys warned, though she was already creeping forward. "We won't get caught," Cregan said confidently. "We move like shadows. Jon, keep watch. If anyone comes down the hall, whistle." Jon nodded silently, taking up a position near a suit of decorative armor, his dark eyes scanning the corridor. He didn't use the magic of the old gods. He used the simple, practical awareness of a boy who knew the castle's rhythms. Cregan and Rhaenys slipped into the kitchen. They stayed low, darting behind the massive wooden prep tables, avoiding the hurried footsteps of the kitchen maids carrying baskets of root vegetables. They reached the cooling rack. Resting on a baking sheet were a dozen perfectly golden sweet rolls, glazed with honey and dotted with dried berries. Cregan reached up, his hand hovering over the prize. He didn't use any unseen forces. He used his own clumsy, eager hands. He grabbed 3 rolls, juggling them as the hot, sticky honey burned his fingers. "Got them," Cregan hissed triumphantly, tossing one to Rhaenys. Rhaenys caught it smoothly. "Let's go before Gage turns around." They scrambled back toward the entrance, nearly colliding with a maid carrying a sack of flour, but managed to slip past her unnoticed. They burst out into the corridor, where Jon was waiting. "Success," Cregan grinned, handing one of the rolls to his brother. They tore into the sweet, warm bread, the sugar an instant rush of energy. "We need to eat these outside," Jon murmured, brushing crumbs from his tunic. "If we leave crumbs in the hall, they will track us." They hurried out into the main courtyard. The afternoon sky had turned a flat, unbroken gray, and thick, heavy flakes of snow had begun to fall, dusting the mud of the yard in a pristine layer of white. They finished their stolen rolls near the armory, wiping their sticky hands on their trousers. "Look," Rhaenys whispered, pointing across the yard. Arthur Dayne was crossing the courtyard. He was off duty, dressed in a thick gray cloak over his casual clothes, eating a green apple. He was walking at a relaxed pace, his mind seemingly elsewhere as he headed toward the great keep. Cregan looked at the fresh snow gathering on the tops of the barrels near the armory. He looked at Rhaenys. A mischievous, wicked grin spread across his face. "A test of his quickness," Cregan whispered. Rhaenys immediately caught on, her eyes lighting up. "He always says we should strike when the enemy is distracted." Jon sighed quietly, stepping back slightly. "This is a terrible idea." "It's a brilliant idea," Cregan corrected, scooping up a handful of wet snow and packing it tightly into a hard, icy ball. Rhaenys did the same, molding a perfectly round ball of hard snow. They crept out from behind the armory, hiding behind a cart of firewood to close the distance. Arthur was 20 paces away, taking a bite of his apple, entirely relaxed. "On 3, Cregan whispered. 1, 2, 3. Cregan and Rhaenys stepped out from cover and hurled their snowballs with all their might. They were good throws, fast, accurate, and aimed directly at the back of Arthur Dayne's head. Arthur didn't turn around. He didn't even break his stride. As the missiles of snow closed the final few feet, Arthur simply tilted his head an inch to the left and dipped his right shoulder slightly. The 2 snowballs whistled harmlessly past his ears. Smack, smack. Walking about 10 paces behind Arthur was Jory Castle, carrying a ledger toward the stables. He didn't have the quickness of the sword of the morning. He took both snowballs directly to the face. Jory sputtered violently, dropping his ledger and wiping the freezing slush from his eyes and beard with a startled curse. Arthur paused, taking another crunching bite of his apple. He casually glanced toward the battlements, not looking back at the children. "Your aim is improving," Arthur called out to the empty air, his voice thoroughly amused. "But your quarry selection needs serious work." Cregan and Rhaenys stood frozen in horror as Jory Castle blinked the snow away and glared furiously in their direction. "Run!" Cregan yelled. The 3 pups scattered instantly, bolting across the snowy courtyard and diving into the safety of the twisting corridors of the inner keep, leaving a trail of laughter and footprints in the fresh snow. As evening fell and the sky darkened to a deep, bruising purple, the children returned to the training yard. Torches were lit in the iron sconces along the walls, throwing flickering orange light across the grounds. The physical torture of the morning was over. Now came the art. Arthur Dane stood in the center of the ring, holding two blunted wooden practice swords. He wore a heavy leather jerkin over his tunic to ward off the evening chill. But he wasn't alone. Anna stood beside him. She wore simple boiled leather trousers and a loose tunic, her red-dyed hair tied back securely. She held a slender ashwood waster, tapping it lightly against her leg. Cregan, Rhaenys, and Jon jogged into the yard, shedding their cloaks. "Split the ring," Arthur commanded, his voice carrying effortlessly. "The boys with me. Princess, you are with Anna this evening." Rhaenys' eyes lit up. She admired Arthur's flawless technique, but Anna fought like a wildcat, moving with an unpredictable, fluid speed that Rhaenys desperately wanted to master. Rhaenys stepped into the smaller ring, raising her wooden sword. "I'm ready." Anna smiled, a fierce, wolfish grin. "We'll see. Don't look at my sword, Rhaenys. Look at my shoulders. The sword only goes where the shoulder tells it to." Anna lunged. She was blindingly fast, employing the agile, evasive footwork typical of northern skirmishers. Rhaenys danced backward, parrying a quick thrust, then immediately spinning to deflect a high slash. They moved together like partners in a deadly, rapid dance, Anna constantly pushing the young girl to move faster, to stay lighter on her feet. In the larger ring, the dynamic was entirely different. "You survived the mud this morning," Arthur said to Cregan and Jon. "Now we test your quickness. 2 against 1. You must work together, or you will fall individually." He didn't give them a countdown. He simply moved. Arthur lunged forward with terrifying, explosive speed. He aimed a sweeping horizontal strike with his left-hand sword at Cregan's ribs, while simultaneously driving a sharp thrust with his right-hand sword toward Jon's chest. Cregan roared, bringing his sword down in a heavy, two-handed block. Clack! He stopped Arthur's blade, but the impact sent a jarring shock up his arms. Jon didn't block. Relying on his smaller size, he dropped low, letting Arthur's thrust pass over his shoulder, and darted in, aiming a precise strike at the back of Arthur's knee. It was a cunning, well-timed maneuver, but Arthur Dane possessed an uncanny awareness of his surroundings. He didn't even look down. He hopped lightly over Jon's sweeping blade, brought his right heel down hard to pin Jon's wooden sword to the mud, and tapped the back of Jon's head gently with the pommel of his left-hand sword. "Dead," Arthur noted calmly. Jon sighed, pulling his sword free and stepping back to the edge of the ring. "Do not let him dictate the rhythm," Cregan shouted, stepping in to deliver a barrage of heavy, aggressive overhead chops. "Push him back." Cregan attacked with raw, unbridled power. Every swing was meant to break through Arthur's guard by sheer force. Arthur retreated 2 steps, his twin blades moving like a windmill, deflecting the heavy blows outward rather than meeting them edge to edge. When Cregan overextended on a massive swing, Arthur simply stepped inside his guard and tapped his chest. "Dead," Arthur repeated. "Your strength is excellent, Cregan, but strength without patience is just a loud way to die. Go again." By the time supper was served, the castle was cloaked in the heavy, dark blanket of a northern winter night. The family gathered in the smaller, private dining hall. The long oak table was laden with roasted venison, hot root stews, and thick slices of dark bread. The exhaustion of the long day had finally caught up with the children. Cregan practically fell asleep into his mashed turnips, his head nodding heavily. Rhaenys sat quietly, her usual fiery energy subdued, resting her head against Elia's shoulder. Jon sat beside Ned, silently observing the fire crackling in the hearth, fighting his own losing battle against sleep. Ned sat at the head of the table, a cup of hot cider in his hand. He looked down the table at Ashera, who offered a tired but contented smile over baby Ricard's head. He looked at Anna and Elia, sharing a quiet conversation. He looked at Arthur, who was quietly eating his meal, completely unbothered by the day's events. "Did you find the culprits who assaulted poor Jory in the yard today?" Ned asked mildly, taking a sip of cider. Cregan's head snapped up from his turnips, his eyes wide. Rhaenys suddenly found the grain of the wooden table incredibly fascinating. "I believe they were ghosts, my lord," Arthur replied smoothly, not looking up from his plate. Very small, very fast ghosts with a craving for sweet rolls. Ned offered a small, knowing smile.